everyone, welcome back. We're going to pick up kind of where we left off, backtrack a little bit to part 3. As we talked about Levenger's ego development, and the 6 stages, we can see largely where the ego is being generated from being totally symbiotic with a caregiver to ultimately at the highest stages, which not everyone achieves, is to be autonomous, that is kind of self-regulating, if we want to return to those terms. Now, what's the deal on ego affectance? Well, it allows us to better interact with the environment and employ more successfully defense mechanisms, of the nature that Freud described. And as we saw in this graph, then we see people who are capable of operating defense mechanisms successfully and have a more well-developed ego avoid, clinical depression. And this is the use of adaptive defenses. So here, when people are not using any defenses, and they have high life stress, then we see high level potential for maybe 80% of the sample to be depressed. As the use of adaptive ego defenses increases from, let's say, 0 to 5, we see then is depression falls off. That is through the effective use of these defense mechanisms. So while we give defense mechanisms kind of a bad rap, it also allows us to protect ourselves, hence defend ourselves from threat, both internal and external. So this affectance motivation defined is the tendency to explore and influence one's environment. So one aspect here is that I move outward into the environment and have an impact on the environment. The second arises from experience that demonstrates one's competence. So as I effectively counter stress, as I effectively reduce these conflicts through my use of these mechanisms, then I learn that I am competent in this regard. It's self-efficacy within this narrower domain. This is central to competence motivation theory, that is, that we're motivated by the achievement of competence. So for people high in this kind of construct, then we seek out opportunities to, in fact, better ourselves and demonstrate that success to ourselves. So we move toward domains where we have demonstrated competence and mastery, and then we disidentify, and that would be in terms of self-esteem, with areas that threaten our self-esteem. In this kind of iteration, what we're looking at is moving towards domains where we can demonstrate greater ego affectance, greater mastery over our own circumstances. And this is all a function of the feedback we receive beginning in childhood and learning how we're doing. Right? So ego affectance then, let's take a look at the model. White's model of affectance motivation. So when successful, sense of competence increases, right? And that then increases our affectance motivation because we've been successful, so why not do more of this? So it's the willingness to exercise emerging and existing skills and capabilities. So if we look at ego as a work in progress and we develop more tools into our toolkit and become skilled using them, that would be this box, then inevitable effects on the changes in the environment, that is, we become more empowered and are more able to control our environment rather than to have it control us. All right? And then voluntary attempts to produce intentional, goal-directed changes in the environment, that we choose to do this to a greater extent. So, for many people, their relationship to the world is the world does whatever to them. For some of us, we learn over time through developing power via ego affectance that we can in fact affect our world rather than just be continually reacting to the world. Then we move into an area of becoming proactive. The issue and how this aligns with ego development a la Levenger is we see that we become autonomous human beings, that is, we make choices on how to affect our environment, but we have to know what we want our environment to be, and that's part of becoming that autonomous human being, is understanding where we want to go. And it's no longer conformist, right? It's moving beyond conformity to moving beyond becoming the creator rather than the conformer. So we can see how this, I hope, fits all together. So Freud's drive theory then, we have the source of drive, right? Might be a bodily deficit if we want to keep it basic. The impetus of the drive is the intensity of the psychological discomfort or anxiety that's related to that drive. So not all drives are related equal. Some bodily deficits, the way we interpret them, cause us to react with a greater strength. The object of the drive then is the environmental object capable of satisfying the bodily deficit. And then the aim of the drive is satisfaction by removing the deficit. So we develop mental representations of this process through our experience in life. Right? It could be a food source, the source of the drive, I'm hungry, creates a bodily deficit, there's an array of options for me to eat. Well, what is everyone else eating? And I might take a conformist approach and order what they order. Or I might begin to understand my health, and the choices I make and how it affects me big picture, and it changes my nature, it changes the relationship to my own nature and my own drives. That is, drives become perhaps more healthy as a result of this process. We are works in progress. At least some of us are not continually necessarily reacting to the environment, but creating proactive areas within our own environmental responding. So understanding the object-relation theory, the quality of anyone's mental representation can be characterized by three chief dimensions. That is, and these mental representations are our view of the world, right? And a couple things that we interpret right off the bat, according to Freud and his object-relation theory, is the unconscious tone. Is the object benevolent or malevolent? That is, and if you want to put in real simple terms, good or bad. Notice that attitudes research since what, the 1970s, 1980s, has carved out this little area of attitudes called valence. That is the perception of good versus bad. And it really is just that simple, right? The second part of object relation theory is the capacity for emotional involvement, and that's selfishness and narcissism versus mutual concern. And we can see that some people operate purely through selfishness and narcissism. And if we go back to Levenger's theory, we can see where that would be kind of the second stage of ego development. It's all about me, it's all about what I want, and it really is kind of the toddler view of the world. And then the third component of this is the mutuality of autonomy with others. That is, to what extent, if this person is developing it into an autonomous human being, and to what extent am I? Or to what extent do I perceive that person as an autonomous human being as well as myself? So it kind of allows us to create a map of the way we view the world, but I think more specifically the way we view our relationship to people in the world and objects in the world, right? And here's a map. So if we look at one woman's representation of her relationships with men, let's say that this woman is in a therapeutic kind of psychodynamic therapy, right? And when we say the word men, and remember one thing that Freud wanted to do was look at word associates quite often. So you know, men, and then you respond women, or however you play that little word game, right? But in looking at our relationships with men, what can we pull out? What can we help this woman? What can we help this woman pull out of her own history with men? How are men represented in her psyche as a concept? And relationships with men, well, one portion of relationships with men really kind of is represented by this idea of enslavement, that the man is my master, so to speak. And it can be in terms of household activities, a woman who's forced to cook, clean, etc. But also it could be the sexual enslavement, having to have sex, maybe when she doesn't even want to, or perhaps not in a manner that's satisfying to her. Woman is also then has her sexuality, and if we go back to the Victorian era, notice this is big for Freud because the Victorian era really denied sexuality for women, that sex was an unpleasant act that was used to fulfill the man's needs, but a woman shouldn't find pleasure in it. And women who did were then confronted with the reality that they're not operating the way society should necessarily believe they do, and because of that it sets up conflict. So sexuality, rape, enslavement, dirtiness, right? But it's also a pleasurable activity. And then notice how these become in conflict with each other. And the idea of the therapy would be to realign these ideas, right? Other relationships with men, well, a history of rejection, right? Or a history of closeness. And the closeness might be represented by closeness with the father as a child. I was quite close to my dad, but then it might be closeness with a boy on vacation. That kind of amazing attraction that happens in an instant. But then also the relationship with men is demonstrated a lot of rejection. So the self is rejected by father at some point in life, right? And this then is in conflict with the closeness of the father. And the self is rejected by boys. There was that time in the cafeteria when the boy said, no way, embarrassed. Or going to a dance and not being asked to dance, right? Or the self rejected by the boy stopped calling, right? And then you can see that was in conflict because, boy, I felt so close to this boy that I met on vacation, but then the boy stopped calling, which becomes part of the rejection story. So part of the idea, and Freudian therapy is about going back and uncovering parts of this that became too painful to deal with anymore and became repressed but didn't go away, are still part of this object relation theory. And that's kind of the psychodynamic approach. And notice this is really kind of theoretically and philosophically motivated. It's insanely difficult to empirically demonstrate that any of this actually occurs. And that will be the issue that many people take with Freud. But what do we know in common? What do we know about currently? Well, we know that the mind is built on a rich set of associations, and the map of those associations that we look at and we can try to study, especially social psychologists, when we look at priming studies and the associates they pull up, might not be a whole lot different than this. Right? So we have this associational network. Again, though, in Freud's time, difficult to empirically demonstrate. So criticisms of the psychodynamic approach, well, as we've been talking about throughout here, many of Freud's concepts just aren't scientifically testable. They're not amenable to testing. How do you set up a disconfirmable hypothesis for many of these ideas? It becomes quite difficult. Not that it can't be done. And if people had the desire to revisit these ideas, probably could, although often people do revisit these ideas, but they strip away the Freudian terminology and kind of build their own new novel theory that they can test, thus divorcing themselves from Freud. Other criticisms of the psychodynamic approach, the concepts arose from case studies of disturbed individuals, and this is a big one because Freud is talking about people who have psychodynamic conflict and then telling us a story where we all do. But Freud wasn't dealing with a lot of like normal, I hate using that term, but normal, unconflicted or average people. So if you learn how the brain works for distressed individuals, can you then say that everyone operates in a similar manner? On the flip side, we are creatures of conflict, and I think most of us are willing to admit, at least anecdotally, that we're often driven by conflicts or kind of stopped in our tracks by conflicts. Many points about human motivation and emotion were simply wrong. That's a stiff statement to say they were wrong. I might want to back off and say they were unsupported, and they may continue to be unsupported in certain contexts. That doesn't mean necessarily that they're wrong. It maybe means that people haven't necessarily developed the support. One thing we have to adapt to in psychology is it's a fluid science. And we are more than willing to say, hey, what we knew before, we've figured out some new things that have much stronger empirical evidence than what we demonstrated before in another regard. So, and I think that's one of the beauties of psychology. It's a book that will never have the final chapter written. It's going to always be open to edits. Right? The methods of data collection were pretty weak in Freud's time. We look at the case study, and of course most of us are not enamored by the case study in this day and age. We use case study as the last resort when we don't have numbers or empirical testing available to us. And psychoanalytic theory is woeful as a predictive device. So if we attempt to use what we've learned via psychoanalysis to predict behavior, we can run into problems. And remember that behavioral predictions are almost always universally better for the short-term predictions, but pretty poor in terms of long-term predictions. I wouldn't say that psychoanalytic theory stands alone. We can see, and we talk about this especially in psych and law, that predicting, for example, who will be violent in the future can be very difficult. Easier to predict in the short term, harder to predict in the long term. So it's not just psychoanalytic theory that suffers in its predictive power. I think it's a lot of psychological perspective that is often weak in its predictive power. Okay? And I can leave you with the two general rules of psychology. I know we've talked about them before. I continue. What's the best predictor of future behavior? All else being equal, it's past behavior. But and kind of maybe a flip side of that, though, is that you can't change people, and that's rule number 2 for psychologists. So that's it in 3 parts for kind of the psychoanalytic motivation qualities. Let's face it, the id is a powerful motivator. The ego, informed by both the id and the superego, is stuck in the middle. The superego says, hey, it says do it, do it. The superego says no, don't do it, it's wrong, it's illegal, it's immoral. And it's the ego that's stuck in the middle trying to sort it out and making the best choice that it can for us, right? But if our history demonstrates a lack of competence, then in fact we may be making more poor choices than we do beneficial choices for ourselves. And that speaks to Levenger's theory of ego development. That is, as we move up, we'll probably make choices more consistently that are to the benefit of us. So let's call it good for today. We'll come back for chapter 15 next time, and Rosie's going to say hola, she's going to say hello, and she's going to say goodbye for this lecture. I don't know where she is. She was running around like a maniac a little earlier. So I think she heard her name. She knew she was featured as the last slide in this lecture, so she wanted to make sure to see the whole thing, and she's been around for it. So take care, you guys. Stay healthy, stay safe.